Well, let's see. Okay, I wanted to get back into the dialogue a little bit. Really, we're just getting started. I'm sure you noticed that a part of this dialogue is just emotions that come out. That these guys, some of them really don't like each other, and you can tell that. And actually, it's important to note that because, as you no doubt are aware, politics is a lot about emotion. And the reason why it's about emotion is because the things involved in politics that people argue about are so important. They're important for their future, for their very lives, you know. There's really nothing more important. Everything else is affected by politics in our world, and that's why actually we see Gorgias acknowledging that and actually trumpeting it in these first few pages here. For better or worse, it really is the overarching science because it impacts everything else, including the hard sciences, you know. Like, just look at what's going on with medical science now, right? We're debating the Affordable Care Act and all that, and of course the government provides a lot of funding for basic medical research too, and sets a lot of health policy in general, and has for a long, long time in our country. So what's more important, politics or science in that case? Okay. Science can't move forward without a certain amount of commitment from the society. Money is important. Where does money come from? Us, through government, right? And so if you look around the world, you'll find that a country may have wonderful natural resources. It has intelligence, you know, available human capital, as we call it, etc. But politics can either promote that and make it the best it can be, or it can totally stop it from succeeding. Okay. Japan. Well, now it's going through some difficulties, but for years Japan was, you know, we were worried about Japan getting ahead of us, even though Japan is a pretty small island with not a lot of natural resources, but it had great human capital and its political system works pretty well. Okay. In Africa, there are countries that are, in the Middle East, there are countries torn with political strife. If it weren't for that, they've got fantastic natural resources and people who could do great things. Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to say is really, you know, Gorgias is going to claim, and I think Socrates would agree, politics is the most important human art, so to speak. It's important. It can do great harm or it can do great good. Okay? But there's no getting around it in this world. And that's why it brings out so much emotion in people, is because they know that it's going to impact their lives at every level, for better or worse. It's gonna largely determine, you know, what their life is going to be like. All right. So now, when Polus says, you know, he's been asked by Chaerephon to tell us what he thinks of rhetoric, when he says rhetoric is the noblest of all arts, okay, he is saying that it's very, very important. Like I just said, I mean, he senses that it's very important. Maybe the most important. But Socrates says that Polus is being defensive in his answer. What does that mean? Does anybody know why Socrates accuses him of being defensive? When somebody's defensive, what does it mean? Yeah.
I think what it means is that Socrates is saying, or is of the belief that rhetoric is actually kind of a way to dupe the ignorant into believing what they want, and Polus, knowing that it has a lot of power, is trying to defend that use of power, saying that it's not bad, but even though it can be corrupted, is what Socrates is trying to say.
Yeah, Socrates is really coming from the opposite point of view. Obviously, when Polus uses the word noble, you know, that means that it is, in his view, truly to be esteemed, to be admired. It's the best, you know, not just because of the power, but, you know, it's the worthiest to study, to pursue, and so forth. And I think you're right that Socrates will disagree pretty profoundly about that. And his suspicion, his deep suspicion, is that rhetoric is used in democratic politics to dupe people or manipulate people and so forth. When he says that Polus is being defensive, he's kind of suggesting that Polus is covering that part of it up, right? That by saying that it's the noblest of all arts, he's putting the spotlight on the best, but avoiding any discussion of the worst. And further, he is actually not, in Socrates' view, saying enough, okay? When you say it's the noblest, well, what does that really mean? It's just sort of high praise, but why is it the noblest? Can you defend it? Can you actually say that it is the most worthy, the best, and so forth? So we find Socrates asking a lot of questions, obviously, and trying to get people to be very specific. So Gorgias, of course, jumps in. He's the guy who really ought to be answering. You remember Polus got into this, and he comes back pretty soon because he thinks that he can sort of show his talents, maybe show off a little bit to Gorgias. And he's kind of belligerent to Chaerephon and to Socrates. But Gorgias is an older person, and he has been around, he's talked a lot. He is not defensive in that sense, and he's not, you can sort of feel that Gorgias is to a certain extent a great guy, okay? Because he's much more generous with his information, okay? He doesn't feel threatened easily, all right? So he says, I will answer that question. My art is rhetoric, and I can teach it. Okay, now he's not saying what rhetoric is yet or what its aim is yet, okay? But at least he's saying, okay, look, I'm the guy who does it. I know what it is. And so I both do it and I teach it, okay? Which, as they say, are two very different skills, right? Some people know how to teach but not to do. Some people know how to do and not to teach, and so forth. So here's an extraordinary guy. He can do both, supposedly, all right? Now, Socrates will actually dispute later on, by the way, I'll just warn you, he actually disputes whether it can really be effectively taught. And maybe this is not something that can you teach somebody to be a world-class public speaker? Okay. You can teach people how to be a public speaker, but can you teach somebody to be world-class, to be the best? Or is that something that comes just from within because they happen to have that in them? So he does question that. But anyway, at this point, Socrates asks him the crucial question, which is, basically everybody knows he does rhetoric and teaches it, but what is the aim of it? What is the goal of it? Why do you do it? Okay? Why do you give these speeches? And why do you want to teach other guys to do them? And why do they flock to you? Okay? Because Gorgias has a lot of students wherever he goes. People are wanting to learn what he has to know, And I'm sure in their minds it's about, gosh, I want to be like him, and I want to be famous. I want to be powerful. This is the way to do it in a democratic society. But Socrates asks this question, and Gorgias answers it. Okay? And I wanted to add, this is a little out of sequence, but I wanted to add this before I give you the full answer. They do agree on a couple of things. If you have your book on page 14, near the top of the page, or if you have a different version and you've got the side numbers, it's near 455. Okay? We have Socrates saying, so rhetoric, it seems, affects a persuasion which can produce belief about justice and injustice, but cannot give instruction about them. Let me put that up on the screen. This seems like a minor matter, but actually it turns out to be a pretty major matter for him. Okay? It affects a persuasion. Okay? It persuades. It produces belief. Okay? And he uses that's a specific term. It produces belief. Remember, we talked about belief or opinion versus knowledge last time. So he's making that distinction. It produces opinion or belief about justice and injustice. And remember, that's important because what is politics really all about? What is political rhetoric really all about? If you listen carefully, it really is all about justice and injustice, right and wrong, okay? But it cannot give instruction about them. Okay, what's the difference? What does he mean, instruction about them? What would that take, do you think?
He knows how to persuade people to feel a certain way, but he doesn't know actually how to inform them, how to make their own knowledgeable opinions that are based around more facts and real information.
Yeah, that's what he's saying, right? That Gorgias knows how to make people feel a certain way, and he can sort of sway them to an opinion, but that opinion is superficial. And remember, we talked about how it can be easily changed because of that. Whereas instruction would have to be something that takes more time, that involves argument, where you really have to persuade somebody and they internalize that, and then they have their own true opinion that they can defend. Okay? It doesn't mean that they can't change it because, as I said before, you may get a new argument, new facts may make you change your mind, but it's a more solid thing, right? Because you have backing for it. You know why you think the way you do. So he's saying rhetoric can't do that. And then down here they agree on this, because Gorgias agrees. Socrates says the rhetorician then is not a teacher of law courts and other public gatherings as to what is right or wrong, but merely a creator of beliefs, for evidently he could never instruct so large a gathering on such a weighty matter in a short time. Okay? So this is part of the reason why rhetoric can't teach people, why it can't jump into that role of teacher and instructor, because you have large crowds and you have a short time. Okay? So you can't have a dialogue. You can't have a lot of question and answer. You've got a format where it's really kind of impossible. Okay? So if you've only got a half an hour, 45 minutes, you're going to be able to persuade if you're good, but you can't teach. And Gorgias says he certainly couldn't. And Gorgias is not at all upset about this, because Gorgias doesn't think that a person can actually teach to that degree anyway. And let me try to explain that a little bit. Gorgias had a philosophy, which comes out here, but only it's hinted at. He doesn't actually explain it here. But Gorgias had a philosophy that people couldn't transmit knowledge to each other anyway. Okay? When I say X, Y, and Z, okay, you hear it, but you hear it through your personal experiences and your background and all kinds of things, your gender, your age, all that stuff factors in. And so what you hear, he thought, couldn't be the same as what I said anyway. You would have your own take on it. You would have your own perception. And perceptions can be quite different. People can walk out of a room and then they discuss what just was said, and they disagree. You know that, right? So Gorgias picked up on that, and he really took it to the extreme, and he said, you really can't directly transmit knowledge. What's in my mind I can't make you see it exactly the same way. So Gorgias argues, what's the point in trying to do that then? Human beings are persuadable, but teaching them past a certain point in the philosophical sense is kind of hard to do, pretty much impossible. Okay? So Gorgias is somebody who believes that perspective trumps knowledge. Okay? Perspective is everything. Another sophist said, man is the measure of all things, meaning, we judge what we hear. We judge the world, right? And we see it the way we want to see it. And political philosophers have had to grapple with this part of human nature forever. That people see what they want to see, they hear what they want to hear. The thing about Gorgias is he thinks that's pretty much all there is. It's really rather futile to try what Socrates is trying and really deeply teach, because people are resistant to it. It's hard for them to do it. because of their perceptions and their opinions and so forth. They're going to walk away with what they think and what they want to think and so forth. So that's where Gorgias is coming from. All right, when he agrees with Socrates. Socrates does not agree with Gorgias that it's futile to try. He does think that you can get beyond opinion and perspective, but you have to do it in small groups, you have to do it face to face, you have to have a fairly serious and lengthy conversation, you have to try to put emotion aside to a great extent so that you can actually get this connection. It can't be done, he would agree, in large groups of people. Okay? So, and I put here, these are problems that all democracies suffer from, because in a democracy you can't get beyond the need to speak to very large groups of people. I mean, even if it's Athens, which was a heck of a lot smaller than the United States of America, we're talking about maybe 5,000, 6,000 people sitting in the assembly at any given time, listening to speakers. Okay? So you can't have a dialogue with 5,000 or 6,000 people. In our system, we have representatives who are trying to decide how to vote, and they will try to persuade the people to support them so that they can get reelected. They'll be speaking to entire states full of people, if not the entire nation, to the degree that they can. And boy, is it hard to get people's attention. That's why millions and millions of dollars are spent in political campaigns, because it's just very hard in this huge competition for people's time to even get their attention. All right? So I think Socrates would agree with Gorgias here, although Socrates would see this as a weakness for democracy. Okay? It's a problem for democracy that can't go away as long as you have a democracy, that people don't have a lot of time, that it's hard to get their attention span is short. Okay? They don't know a lot about a lot of subject matters that politicians want to talk about. And there's really not too much that you can do to get beyond that problem in a democracy. For Gorgias, this is great, okay, because the very weaknesses of the people equal the strength of the rhetorician. It creates an environment where a rhetorician can thrive, you know. Public speaking isn't too great of a skill to have in an oligarchy, a dictatorship. It can get you killed, okay? But in a democracy, it is the number one most powerful tool. Occasionally it got people killed in a direct democracy too, but not as often. So, all right, let's look and see what Gorgias says rhetoric's aim is. Okay? If I can find my book. All right. This is great. You got to pay attention to this, because he really does give you a very full answer on page 10, up above number 453. Gorgias says to Socrates, I mean the ability to persuade with words judges in the law courts, senators in the Senate, assemblymen in the assembly, and men in any other meeting which convenes for the public interest. So that's a lot right there. Persuade the people in law courts, in political assemblies, anywhere where there's a public issue, okay? Where people have to decide on this or that policy. Since it is perfectly true that by virtue of this power, and he does think it's a power, that's not the last time he's going to term it like that, it's a power. By virtue of this power, you will have at your beck and call the physician and the trainer, and the businessman of yours will turn out to be making money for somebody else. Not for himself will he make the money, but for you who have the power to speak and persuade the vast majority. Okay? Now think about that. That's a different way of thinking about political power. Okay? The good politician, the successful politician, has at his disposal other people. They're not directly working for him necessarily. He's got a staff and so forth, right? But he's talking about you and me. Everybody in the country, okay, is working for that person, because they're working under his laws and his policies, okay? And so he even goes so far as to connect money with it. The businessman is not making money for himself, he's making it for you. Okay? What does he mean by that?
from your taxation and power that comes through the policies you can set.
Absolutely. That businessman is paying taxes. The taxes go to the government, and the politician gets to decide how to spend the money. Okay? So it's not his money directly. It's not put directly in his bank account, we hope, right? I mean, that doesn't happen very often. Every once in a while it does. But for the most part, it's, like in our country, the IRS collects it. It goes to the Treasury, and the government spends it. But this is a unique perspective, isn't it? That it's really the politician's money. Now, a lot of politicians would disagree and say, no, I'm here because I want to be a good steward of public interest. I'm going to spend the money, but I'm going to do it for the welfare of the general public. And I think that a lot of politicians actually do have that attitude. I'm not a total cynic. I think, it depends, all right? Gorgias is a little bit of a cynic, and he actually likes the idea of having all that money at his disposal. And even further, I guess you could probably say the businessman isn't just making the money, it's not just the taxes the businessman pays, but through the laws and the policies, okay, of politicians, the rest of the money he makes is employed in certain ways and not in others. He can spend it on this, but he can't spend it on that, okay? This market is open to him, that is not. Why? Because of policy, right? So the money is used and channeled through the policies and laws of the government, and to that extent, it's really kind of all the government's money from Gorgias' perspective, all right? So you are the puppet master, okay, in Gorgias' back in a town I used to live in, we had this guy. He owned banks, and he really was involved in politics. And we used to call him the big hand. Okay, the big hand. He was always there in the background. He was organizing everything. He was doing everything, but you didn't see the big hand. Okay, very often the big hand was invisible, but it was always there, and it was basically manipulating a lot of things. So Gorgias' dream is to be the big hand, right? The invisible hand, so to speak. But not the invisible hand of economics, of Adam Smith, but the invisible hand of government, reaching in and doing what he wants to do with the society. He says that is the greatest power, okay, that you can have. And I think that Socrates would agree with that. The government has that greatest earthly power that people can have. And that's why it's so important from his perspective that we figure out what government should do and who should be in charge and so forth. For Gorgias, it's just an incredible opportunity, and it's right there, for him and for other people to use for their advantage. And he's very attracted to power. I don't want to steer you wrong here. Later on, we start talking more about money in the history of political thought, that people want to get rich, and that's why they do what they do. But at this point, it's power, power and the honor and the glory that comes with power and that great feeling. And actually, if you talk to people involved in politics and they're honest, they will tell you that that's still the case for an awful lot of them. They like that feeling of participation and involvement and having influence that goes beyond just walking into a voting booth and voting. It gives them a charge, okay? Well, Gorgias is very open about this. He's saying what an awful lot of people know and experience, but maybe in our society, because of the context in which we live, we're ashamed to say it directly, okay? But it gives people a charge. It gives people this great, basically sort of like a high, They are able to affect things and to do things beyond what other people can do. They are elevated above the norm, okay? So he's very, very clear, and he is not ashamed to say this, okay? At this point, he says, it is persuading the vast majority for the interest of the speaker, okay? And this is what Socrates objects to, okay? Gorgias says this is the great power, and Socrates would agree it's a great power, but it's objectionable, He doesn't like it because he believes that it can be abused, all right? Everybody got that? All right, so what we find going on in this dialogue at a deeper level then is this clash between the life of the pursuit of power and wealth and the life of the pursuit of knowledge. And Socrates would say justice, because knowledge goes with justice, or you can't know justice without pursuing knowledge, without pursuing philosophy. Okay? So you start to get this dichotomy, this competition between these two ways of life, and the question being, which way is best? And from a concrete perspective, these young men that are sitting around listening to Gorgias, trying to learn the art of rhetoric, what would really truly be in their best interest? Would it be to stick with Gorgias and to learn his skills? Or would it be to maybe come over to Socrates and take part in his dialogues? Which of these two teachers has the best stuff that will lead to happiness? Okay? Happiness becomes an issue. Okay? Which one makes you happy? And when you think about it, an awful lot of what we do seriously revolves around this. Okay? What will make us happy? Okay? That's what we want to be, right? We want to be miserable. But we have different definitions of happiness. We have different ideas about what will make us happy. And we profoundly disagree about what will make us happy. Okay? And throughout the course of your life, it changes too. It changes. And what you thought would make you happy when you were in your 20s is not even really very important when you're in your 40s or 50s. Okay? So I just warn you a little bit there, but don't give up on what you're doing now. It'll just happen to you one day and be like, shit, I really don't care anymore about that. So it provides some interest in life. Okay? But we want to be happy, and the question is, which way? And it's a serious question, because people who pursue this way of life will tell you, if you interview them, they'll say, hell yeah, I'm happy. I got my multi-million-dollar apartment in New York, and I'm selling my fashions or whatever around the world. And I've got what I want. This is my dream. And other people who, ask a guy who decided to join a monastery at the age of 25 or whatever, he's living in next to silence, got no possessions. Are you happy? He'll say, yeah, I'm happy. Yeah, what I want. So it's a good question, because people will confirm both of those very sincerely. Okay? All right. So as we go through the dialogue, we'll keep coming back to that. Okay? But there's another issue that comes up, and that is social responsibility. Okay? I think Gorgias confirms Socrates' suspicion that sometimes what rhetoricians say and the changes that they affect through their rhetoric actually do harm the society. Okay? They can do bad things. Rhetoricians can. Okay? Things that might enrich them somehow or make them more powerful, but they don't benefit society. Okay? And this is where Gorgias chokes a little bit, because if he were being really consistent and honest, he would probably say, of course, sometimes it doesn't benefit society, but, rhetoric is for the interests of the speaker. Okay? But while he's being questioned about this issue of responsibility, okay, he does kind of backtrack a bit. And he gets into a fairly serious discussion of who is responsible for the misdeeds, which is an admission right there, the misdeeds of rhetoricians. Okay? So he's admitted that rhetoricians can do misdeeds, they can do bad things. And the question then is, well, are you, the teacher, responsible? at all. Let's say that you taught them and they go out and they start a big war, and the war turns out to be, bad thing for the society, or they go out and they spend a lot of money and waste it, and then people don't have enough money to do something they do need. Who's responsible for those misdeeds? Okay. Well, let's take a look at this little line of argument here. It's on page 15, or a couple of inches down from number 456. Gorgias makes quite a boast here. First of all, put this up here. This is really something, but when you think about it, it's really quite true, I think. He says, this is Gorgias, he says, I make the further declaration that if a rhetorician and a physician should come to any city you please and have occasion to debate in the assembly or other public gatherings as to which of them ought to be elected the public physician, which would be sort of like our Surgeon General, right? The doctor would be utterly eclipsed, and the capable speaker would, if he chose, be elected. Okay, so there's quite a boast. Is he probably right about that? That if you put a politician, a very capable public speaker, and sat him across from a very knowledgeable doctor, and they're competing for which one will be Surgeon General in front of a crowd, he says the politician will win every time.
Depends on who's in the crowd.
It depends on who's in the crowd. That's true. So it'd make a difference if it were just a group of general public, or whether it was maybe medical people, involved in nurses, doctors, and so forth, involved in the medical field. Okay, but I'm sure he's talking about a crowd of general public. Okay. So, yeah, you'd like to think, I hope I hope he's wrong, actually. I'm kind of thinking maybe a crowd just might look at their qualifications and use common sense. But that's what he thinks, that it's that powerful. So, in other words, rhetoric trumps expertise. Okay? It is more powerful than expertise in the view of the common people. All right? So, but then here's where he starts talking about responsibility, because he's been asked by Socrates. He says, one should, however, Socrates, make use of rhetoric in the same way as one does every other sort of proficiency. This too one should not employ against any and everybody, because a man has learned to be so proficient in boxing or wrestling or the use of arms that he's superior to friend and foe alike. That's no reason for him to go about beating or stabbing and killing his neighbors or his friends. And if a man frequents the gymnasia and gets his body into first-rate condition, becomes a prize fighter, and then takes to beating his father and mother or his friends and relatives, that's no reason for detesting and banishing the trainers and teachers in the art of fighting. You can recognize that they imparted their instruction to be used rightly in self-defense against enemies and criminals, but the pupils perverted their own strength and skill to its wrong use. The teachers, therefore, are not evil, nor is their art responsible for these misdeeds, nor is it vicious in itself. Those who misuse the art I hold to be responsible. Okay, let me stop there for a second and ask you what you think he's saying there. Mm-hmm.
Just because somebody picked and chose what part of a lesson they wanted to listen to and decided to train their body, not their mind, and became this ultimate fighter, doesn't give them the right to use their skills however they see fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's actually...
The teacher is not to blame.
Right, the teacher is not to blame because the student made his choices, right, about what to learn and how to use that. Yeah.
If you wanted to talk about defensive, that's what this is. It sounds like he's absolving himself of any guilt. Any being able to be accused of misusing his own teaching ability.
Yeah, he is definitely trying to distance himself from the responsibility, right? As a teacher, he's saying, I teach skills. I teach students the nuts and bolts of public speaking, how to do it well. What they do with it is their business. What they do with it if it harms someone, is their choice, okay, and not my responsibility. Be like, I think what he's trying to maybe liken himself to when he talks about the prize fighter and so forth is kind of like what, if any of you have done martial arts at all, you know that the instructor will tell you, directly, you use this for self-defense, but just because you become better at fighting does not mean you should use it to bully people or to harm innocent people, right? You've got to be responsible with it. So here he sounds kind of like that. And of course, under those circumstances, if a student went out and harmed his parents or something like that, would you blame the martial arts instructor? No, why? Because he's tried to do the responsible thing. He's tried to, tell students, I'm teaching you this, but you've got to be responsible with it.
I think that comes down to culture, though. I mean, in our culture, in the Greek culture of ancients, and yeah, they may not think that the finger needs to be pointed at the teacher, but in Kung Fu culture, the finger definitely would be pointed at the teacher.
Because you'd wonder what didn't they teach them? Yeah. Why didn't you get this across to them? That's a good point. Now, Gorgias makes it sound here like he's actually giving that spiel about how to use rhetoric justly, but the problem is he's not. And this is why Socrates so strongly objects, okay, is that we've just heard Gorgias say to everybody, rhetoric should be used in public places to persuade people to do what the speaker wants. He hasn't been shy about that, okay? So there's a selfish motive behind it, and prior to this point, he has been quite clear about that. But now he's suggesting, in a way he's suggesting he doesn't do that, okay? Or maybe he hasn't thought it through well enough. He's contradicting himself to a certain extent here, okay? And Callicles points that out in a little bit. He's kind of upset with Gorgias because he feels like he has tripped up, made a mistake by kind of admitting that he should teach people right and wrong, okay? And Callicles doesn't think that's necessary. Why does Gorgias do this? It's kind of hard to know whether it's because he thinks that's what Socrates wants to hear and he's not quite thinking about the implications of it for the rest of his argument. He's sitting in a group of people that when he's pressed, he may be a little embarrassed to just remain completely honest. Or maybe he just isn't, following his own train of thought too well here. But he could only say this plausibly if he gave his students that message of responsibility and, this idea that you should only use rhetoric for the benefit of the public, not yourself. And this is not that's not how he sells what he does, okay? Let's just finish up what he says here. He says, exactly the same argument holds for rhetoric also. The rhetorician is capable of speaking against everyone else and on any subject you please in such a way that he can win over the vast multitudes to anything in a word he desires. But the fact that he can rob doctors or any other craftsmen of the credit due them is no reason why he should do so. He must use his skill justly, exactly as one should physical prowess. Okay? So it's just interesting, the reversal here. He's previously described rhetoric as basically doing just that, not robbing doctors but businessmen in a way, and using their money and their work for his benefit. Okay? But now he says you shouldn't do that, all right? And they should know, the students should know. And he actually says a bit later on, if they don't know, he'll teach them. Okay? So I've already, shrink that a little bit. I've already mentioned this quote 16c, but I'll leave that up for a second. But this leads to the question of the responsibility of the teacher. Okay? Under what circumstances is the teacher responsible? And you just mentioned in that martial arts type of culture, maybe it would be expected that you're not a good teacher if you can't get this point across. If a bad pupil comes out and abuses people, maybe people would look to that teacher and say, well, why did you select this person, might be a question, because you have to actually kind of assess the character of the person for this type of activity. And then if you got past that line, then why did you not get your point across about good behavior? Okay. But for a lot of us, we come from, especially in this country, I think, from a different perspective, where it's a perspective of individualism. Okay, and the more individualistic a society is, the more likely it is that people will say, well, it's always the person's responsibility who actually did the misdeed, okay? Because he or she decided to do it, right? That's why we get into these quarrels about, there are actually laws that sometimes get, they try to enforce them as to holding bartenders responsible for deciding to sell somebody yet a drink, under the notion that the bartender ought to be able to figure out if the person is too inebriated to have that drink. If the person goes out and he gets into an auto accident, then sometimes people try to sue the bar, they investigate, try to figure out, should the bartender have known? Now, he's in a crowd of people, it's loud, he's got to rush, he's got to serve everybody, and some people are better than others at hiding their inebriation. That's a whole lot of a mix of issues there, and yet sometimes people sue them, and sometimes those lawsuits are successful. And most of the time what I hear is sort of outrage about that kind of thing, though. How can we blame the guy whose job it is to pour drinks at a bar for this guy's choice to come into the bar, drink far too much, and then get behind the wheel of his car? Okay? So we're individualistic. We reject the idea that we are really extremely our brother's keeper. Okay? And we say the blame falls on the person who did the misdeed. Okay? So there is a difference of opinion, and I think it comes out between Socrates and Gorgias and others on this responsibility. And we find Socrates siding more with the idea that the teacher has a great deal of responsibility in the society, okay, for being a good role model, for teaching correctly, for making sure that people understand right and wrong, that it is, at least to a certain extent, the teacher's responsibility. And that is a fairly foreign idea in our own society, so it's a little difficult to wrap our minds around it. And in the parallels readings, I chose this issue simply because it kind of smacks of the same sort of clash, okay, first of all. And secondly, we all know a little bit about it. All right, so the issue is sex ed and what we're going to do with it, how we're going to deal with sexual issues in the public schools, okay, which are impacted by public policy, where school boards decide, what, if anything, will be taught and how it will be taught, and parents get involved, as you know, in duking it out over these issues. And there's more than these two sides. Obviously, there's a sort of middle position too, but the two we hear the most from are the abstinence-only message, okay, where the view is that schools should simply tell students that they should not have sex because sex is, it could give them an STD, it could give them, it could get them pregnant, etc. Mm-hmm.
So the part of this topic, students are supposed to know right from wrong without being taught is love?
Well, I think that my personal opinion is parents need to deal with this issue and need to teach their students, their kids that. Okay? But as far as the public debate, okay,
I guess what I'm asking is, do we, as a culture, does America still allow, or does the people allow, things to be left out and assumed by the audience?
Mm-hmm. Probably, if I'm getting your point, okay. Maybe you can make it in a different way, though.
No, I
Because I'm
think
still not.
That was my question. Do we, like for instance, as the bodybuilder goes home and feeds his family, and the
Mhm.
teacher is not responsible because he should have known better, do the students know the difference between love and lust, and are they going to act out?
Mhm.
Is that something that should be on the they should be taught?
Well, that's the question is, what do you teach and how far do you go to teach it? And if you get involved in the question of love versus lust, you're getting into values, which most Americans believe is a private matter that should be taught, if anything, at home. And that's why, that hardly ever comes up in any sort of sex education curriculum, unless you're talking about maybe a religious school or something like that, because the very distinction between love and lust is a moral distinction, okay? And public schools, because of the public nature of them, they want to stay away from that. I think it's a great distinction, and I think teaching kids about more the intricacies of what's involved in all this is a really good idea, okay? But I think that because of the nature of our society, it is individualistic, it's rights-oriented, okay? We decided long ago that we would keep values, the important values, out of the public school. Now I'm going to get into dangerous territory here, but out of the public school environment, okay? Unless they're values that everybody can agree on, like we shouldn't bully people, okay? But when it comes to stuff like that, that's a distinction that some people would disagree with, that there is a distinction, okay? So I would say, most likely neither side would want to touch that. Isn't that interesting? And yet it's probably the most important distinction, right? Because if you make that distinction, you're guiding people in the direction of having real relationships, in which case they're less likely to have some of these problems, that come from irresponsible sexual activity, okay? But what we get is schools should teach don't have sex, okay? Or we get schools should teach what to do if you have sex, okay? Responsibility in your sexual behavior. So, which means the use of birth control.
Wouldn't this be one of those moral dilemmas as well? That should be, it's tricky because the love and lust question. It's still a moral dilemma, a moral decision.
Mm-hmm. It's a moral, yes, and this is the point that Socrates would make: it's actually is a moral decision which one of these you choose. It's just that people are in denial about it. Okay, and they'll say it's it's a matter of policy or it's a matter of effectiveness. We'll see studies that show that abstinence works better or the other works better for keeping people from having sex, but nobody wants to touch the moral dimension of it. But you're absolutely right, and I think Socrates agrees, and this is why this is a fairly decent parallel, is that he would say it matters greatly morally which one of these you choose, because it's not just the student's responsibility, it is the teacher's responsibility. The two are kind of tied together. Mm-hmm.
Is Socrates arguing that all decisions about what they teach are moral decisions?
Yes.
And therefore the teacher's culpable
Yeah.
in all the situations?
It really is, and the teacher in this case turns out to be the government. The teacher turns out to be the leaders of the society, whether, like in this example, it's the school board and the school principal and so forth, and the teachers of the school, or any other leader. That there's this notion in Socrates' mind that you cannot get away from morality. Okay? But in public policy, in public discussions, we often try very hard to do so. We sidestep it, we see anything but it, and especially in our society because, by golly, we don't want anybody shoving morality down our throats, right? It's our, my definition isn't the same as yours. But yes, Socrates' opinion is it's irresponsible for people in leadership positions not to understand these things very clearly and be willing to influence the people under them in the right direction, okay? And so they can't get away from this choice. Now, I think that Socrates would come down probably more closely to the abstinence message, although he would probably go a lot farther, as you suggest, and teach people what love actually means, try to teach them how to respect your fellow human beings and so forth. But if he had to choose, it wouldn't be this one, because he would say, by talking to students about all the ways that they can protect themselves from STDs and pregnancy, basically you're saying, have sex, do whatever you want. You're sending the message to people who are 14, 15, 16, 17 years old that whatever they decide is okay, okay? And we'll help you kind of deal with whatever negative consequences might come from that, okay? So the teachers and the principal and so forth in this case are sending the students a moral message, although they would say, the students decide, you know, it's their choice. And what they will often say is, they're choosing already. I mean, it's not us who are having any influence over them. We're just trying to protect them from the consequences of behavior they've already chosen to do, okay?
Wouldn't it be a better question instead of both of these options, just for the public school to teach just the anatomy side of it and how the body works, and then leave the moral choices of how to have safe sex or birth control, even abstinence, out to the families to decide? Because I know as my 12-year-old son, I don't want the school telling him how to have safe sex or what he should do.
Right, yeah.
You know, that'd be something I teach him.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I have a 16-year-old son. I think I've done a very good job with this whole issue. And I did it my own way, and I don't think that way would have been at all replicated by a public school. My sense is that public schools do give the plumbing lesson, but they do go beyond that, at least in our area, to the safe sex message and so forth. And if every parent was responsible, just to kind of play devil's advocate, we wouldn't have a need for sex education. But unfortunately, I think a lot of parents are not. They don't guide their children on this topic. Either they don't talk about it at all, or they do so poorly and give people the wrong impressions, or give their kids the wrong impression based on their own personal behavior too. I mean, we have a society where adult irresponsibility is pretty rampant. And so when kids watch their parents' behavior, what lesson do they get from that, right? So if I had to play devil's advocate, I would say, you know, that your suggestion would be good if we lived in a world where parents were all responsible and knew what the heck was going on, but we don't. So but schools do give people the opt-out choice, at least around here. In other words, you can say you don't want your kid in it, you know, and you can do that. But yeah, I mean, and but I think that to come back to what Socrates' position would be, Socrates would say that's not good enough. He doesn't take the individualistic position that every individual and every family can handle these things for themselves. He does believe that there is a societal responsibility, or there should be, and that you can't escape that. Leaders make policy that affects people. What they learn is among the issues, okay? And therefore they should think very deeply about what is truly good for people to hear, especially young people, I'm sure, because this is when we form people's characters, right? Now, I don't think he would, I agree with those who have said abstinence message is not good enough. I don't think he would probably want to stick with that. He would want to go beyond that and teach people how to be human beings that care about each other and understand their responsibility in the world. But he wouldn't go with this. And the reason why I chose this too is because these people sound a little bit like Gorgias sometimes, okay? They'll say, you know, the students and their families who teach them decide. It is not our responsibility to make that choice. Mm-hmm.
So, I was kind of wondering, you mentioned the thing about how Gorgias thinks that we can't teach. So is Gorgias kind of coming from the perspective that that people are not necessarily going to be moral? So we shouldn't really, we should just try and do politics?
Yeah.
And Socrates is coming from the position that it doesn't matter if they are always being moral, we should try and teach them how to be moral?
Yes.
Is that sort of
That's
their...
a pretty good way to put it. Yes,
Okay.
Gorgias is thinking people will do what they want to do, and they will think what they want to think. And there's, we can persuade them in these public gatherings based on their emotions and so forth, but we can't teach them. Socrates is saying we need to take the time to try to teach them. He would agree that it is impossible to change everybody, and that you can only have so much influence in this world, but you are, as a responsible person, you need to try to make that effort. Otherwise, you're contributing to the overall societal problem, right? So you have a responsibility, especially if you're a leader of some sort, even an intellectual leader, such as he was, to try to have that influence on people, which means you need to spend a lot of time thinking about what is right, what is best for people, before you go trying to talk to them. And then when you talk to them, you need to actually try to teach them at a deep level so that they change. Okay? And then when people change, they become self-governing to a certain extent, he would say, through moral knowledge. Okay? All right, so we already discussed that, but basically that's this idea would be somewhat like Socrates' point of view about this issue. If you teach all those options, just like Gorgias teaches, well, if you want to be a public speaker, you can persuade people to do whatever you want, You can have this guy's money, you can have the expertise of these people over here. If he sells it that way, if he teaches people that, then he is somewhat to blame if they go out and use it irresponsibly. That's what he's told them to do. If we taught kids nothing but how to use birth control, perhaps we would be sending them a message, it's okay, it's normal, go out and do what you want. Okay? And so this would at least be Socrates' point of view. It's sort of giving the seal of approval. Why do Americans not like this when they don't? I know some of you probably agree with Socrates, but it's because we don't like paternalistic government, right? Which means we don't like government being like Big Daddy who tells us how to live our lives. Okay, we got away from that when we had the revolution and everything, and then over time it's just kind of accelerated, and now, the very idea that a politician might have some notion about how we should live our lives is really kind of, we don't like it at all. We respond really rather negatively to that. It's not any of their business what we do in our bedrooms, etc., right? So that's a fairly common reaction, and it just shows you how different the ancient perspective on this through Socrates is from our own. Okay, we don't like it. He knows people actually don't like it either, but he still thinks it's probably the right thing to do. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this issue here of beating the expert. I wanted to point out this passage to you where he actually just says that down at the bottom of page 18, in between 459 and 460. We have Socrates say, so when the rhetorician is more persuasive than the doctor, it is a case of the ignorant being more persuasive than the expert in the company of the ignorant. Is that the way of it or is it not? Gorgias says that is, of course, the way of it in this case. Socrates says, moreover, the rhetorician and his rhetoric will have the same relation to all the other arts. There is no need for rhetoric to know the facts at all, for it has hit upon a means of persuasion that enables it to appear in the eyes of the ignorant to know more than those who really know. And Gorgias says, well, Socrates, isn't that a delightfully easy way of doing things? To make oneself a match for the experts in the other arts, though one has learned none of them, only this one. Okay, so again, here we have Gorgias really boasting and touting the power. The power of rhetoric is you could persuade the, quote, ignorant in these public gatherings and appear to be the expert. So he's back to saying that. And as I said before, we'll find that Callicles, not long from now, gets upset with Gorgias because he's gone back and forth, because he said, well, rhetoric, teachers of rhetoric ought to be responsible, and then he's gone back to what he really thinks, which is the teachers of rhetoric ought to teach people how to do what they want with the skill. They aren't responsible, back and forth. And Callicles thinks he should have been more consistent. Okay. Finally, we have Polus coming back in at the end of this exchange with Gorgias. And he's just sort of funny. He's comic relief in some cases, but let's take a look at page 21. In the middle of that page, under 461, we have Polus erupting with, he comes back in kind of out of the blue, erupting with indignation, you might say, because of all of Socrates' suggestions, right? Socrates has been really, really strongly suggesting that Gorgias doesn't know right from wrong, doesn't care about those issues, right? And he is responsible for bad students because he doesn't care. And Polus says, how is that, Socrates? Do you really believe yourself what you're saying about rhetoric? Or do you think that because Gorgias was ashamed not to admit to you that a man versed in rhetoric didn't also know justice and beauty and goodness, and if he came for instruction without this knowledge, that he would teach him himself? Perhaps a little inconsistency perhaps crept into his argument. That's a thing you love to do, turning the argument to questions like this. Or who do you think would ever deny that Gorgias understands justice and can teach others? It's just downright rude to turn the argument to such questions. What's he done there, or tried to do, by coming in with this attitude of anger and indignation?
Trying to stand up for Gorgias.
Yeah, he's definitely trying to stand up for his teacher, the guy that he admires most, right?
He's trying to put Socrates off his game. He's trying to upset him, to move the topic away from the argument with Gorgias and turn it against Socrates.
Yeah, he's accusing him of being rude. That could be upsetting, and that could make you throw you off what you want to say. Certainly a good technique to use if you want to throw people off is make them a little angry.
I know too that a lot of times in like debates, oftentimes when somebody's out of ammo, essentially, they just resort to be like, it's kind of insulting the person who has the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So Polus is probably like out of answers, and so he's like resorting to yelling at Socrates.
Yeah, that happens too, and that definitely could be the case here, that he doesn't know exactly what to think about this or say, but he does want to defend Gorgias, and so he gets angry and upset, and he accuses Socrates of being rude. He's trying to shame him, and this is a tactic. I don't know if this is what Polus is doing it for or not, but certainly a tactic that you see used in public rhetoric a lot is shaming. You should be ashamed of yourself to even bring this up or to even think that. Trying to cut people off from having an open debate by making some things that you can't even talk about, basically, without being embarrassed.
I was just kind of curious. I wasn't sure if, like, in the context of when they were saying it, if it actually was this way. But it kind of seems to me sometimes that Socrates is a bit rude. Was he widely accepted as being kind of a rude guy in the first place?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was, because he never smooths his statements over or allows for, say, good intentions on the part of his interlocutors. He just basically says exactly what he thinks, and yes, he did have a reputation for being rude.
Along those lines, I also wanted to add that it seems to me that Socrates has his opinion. He thinks he knows what rhetoric is, what it's used for, if it's just, if it's good, and he's guiding every single line towards kind of tripping up Gorgias on purpose.
Yes, and he does that a lot, and I thank you for bringing that up. He, through his questioning and answering, he manipulates the people that he's talking to into showing their own self-contradictions, into getting angry to show that they don't have any answers anymore. So he uses them to make his points. And, it shows the weaknesses of their position, and he's all for that. But the very weakness, as you see, proves his point.
But he also says, in the dialogue itself, that he doesn't want to presume what the other person's thinking, and wants to be very thorough and methodical in his questioning. so he doesn't skip over anything.
Right, he is very, very methodical. And this also gets criticized, because he will take little baby steps along the way to get the other person's point of view out. And then he'll use those steps to kind of trip them up or to show the inconsistencies and so forth. And he's very, very good at it. And some people react to that as almost a form of intellectual bullying, But frankly, if you're not that good at it, then maybe you should become good at it before you, have a discussion with Socrates. But yeah, it does seem almost unfair at times because he just sort of gets people stuck in little corners and takes them down paths and so forth through his questioning. He is not always a likable guy. I think that Socrates did not really care if he was a likable guy. He wanted to be right, and he wanted to persuade people, you might say, or convince them through argument, not through emotion. So for him, the strength of his arguments should prevail. And of course, in the world, as his opponents point out, arguments aren't always the strongest. In other words, logic isn't always the strongest thing out there, that will move people. This is the whole problem that Socrates does acknowledge, but still fights against. He's still a believer in the power of logic and the power of reason to get people to knock them off of their preconceived notions or their opinions to something better. That's what his quest is. So